and I'm going to turn it over directly to you. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks so much, Tom. And really good to be talking to all of you. It is 11:45 p.m. exactly in Adelaide. So if I'm a little slower than usual, I apologize, but I had my mug of black tea, so we should be okay. Before I started talking, I know all of you have read this passage towards the end of the book about knowledge and realization. I just thought I'd read a small chunk of that passage before I begin to sort of backlight my remarks. I'll dive in and then we'll have a chat. Around a decade ago, back when the problem still felt new to me, I began paying attention to the sensation of heat. I knew this was only one of its symptoms, that the problem was much more than a matter of degrees, but this seemed at the time like the simplest way to face its tangibility. On record-setting days, of which there were beginning to be more and more, I'd make a point of stepping outside for a walk, letting the sun strafe my head and weight my shoulders. I'd walk for blocks and blocks just to witness the temperature, the way it slackened my stride and faded through my soles. When it's hot out, everything slows down. Events unspool lazily, sounds seem to slur through a syrup. And yet heat is actually equivalent to speed. Tredecillions of molecules vibrating faster and faster, the whole world buzzing at a higher frequency. I never knew how to square this. I just kept walking through the warmth, like I was passing through a series of heavy curtains, parting them with my face till I could no longer feel them on my skin. This too was a kind of numbness, though it was also a kind of crack. On days like these, hardly anyone would be out, and I'd often have the sidewalk to myself, a whole baking lane of concrete. Still, when I did see someone coming toward me, I felt a greater than normal pressure to engage, make some gesture at the elephant in the room. Unbelievable, we'd say to each other, shaking our sweaty heads, though belief had long since ceased to be relevant. It was extremely hot, in fact, on the day I started mapping my notes into this letter. I wrote all of my ideas down on little sticky notes and arranged them in various patterns on my wall, trying to impose some structure. But as soon as I'd stick one up, another would peel itself off, the heat unsealing it from the plaster, so that one by one the notes fluttered down into a jumble on the floor. Sorting through them, I couldn't remember what went where or how anything related, and this produced a double despair. Because it seemed nothing I wrote would come closer to evoking the problem than the pile of limp paper at my feet. Toward the end of her life, the queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick wrote an important essay on the difference between knowledge and realization. Quote, "The gap between knowing something, even knowing something to be true, and realizing it, taking it as real." It is the disregard for this gap, she argues, that marks one of the critical shortcomings of Western thought, the way we often mistake truth for reality. But they are two very different things. Truth is a strictly epistemological affair, like a switch flipped on in the head, binary, cerebral, instantaneous. Realization, on the other hand, is a process, something that can only be achieved through practice, often over long periods of time. It is possible to know something for months or eons and never realize it. Right at the beginning of a meditation retreat, for example, you are simply told a truth about the impermanence of all things, the illusion of the self. But hearing this, even going so far as to believe it, has almost nothing to do with your ability to take it as real. Per Sedgwick, to practice Buddhism, after all, is to spend all the time you can in the attempt to realize a set of understandings, most of whose propositional contents are familiar to you from the very beginning of your practice. Months before writing the essay, Sedgwick herself had been diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. It was the approach of death that brought her closest to this crucial gap. Death, she wrote, makes inescapably vivid in repeated mental shuttle passes the considerable distance between knowing that one will die and realizing it. Can't the same now be said of the problem, the most comprehensive form of death we've yet to invent? I don't mean this in the ordinary sense with which we exhort the denialists, that they need to wake up and recognize the truth of the problem. The whole point is that, for most of us, the problem is merely true. We've trapped it in a propositional form, caged it behind the bars of graphs. But you can examine all the graphs in the world and still never fully realize the problem, at least insofar as you'd realize the sound of a fire alarm or the tremor of an earthquake. This is a chasm far wider than the one between knowledge and ignorance, though we talk about it less often, maybe because it's too obvious, maybe because it's harder to bridge. Instead, we keep writing the word heat, as if this could ever be the same as feeling its referent wilt the paper. So I decided to share that passage in advance of this lecture because that was an idea I arrived at after spending many months writing this book, sort of tacitly asking myself the whole time, what is it that I'm doing in writing this book? And I didn't set out to write a book. I set out to read a book. I first put pen to paper on Warmth in 2017, and I had been deeply involved in the youth climate movement in the United States for 7 years at that point. And one of the ironic things about being deeply involved in the youth climate movement is that the day-to-day work looked a lot like the day-to-day work in a lot of sort of knowledge economy, knowledge class jobs across the world. I was at my computer, I was sending emails, I was in conference calls. Occasionally I would meet with a senator or host a sit-in outside that senator's office. But there was a way in which the problem itself, which is of course the climate crisis, although I think that name cheapens what it actually is, and I discuss that more in the book, that remained kind of abstract to me in the daily life of being a climate movement organizer. In the same way that I think it's abstract for a lot of people, and that life in the 21st century increasingly requires a kind of dual consciousness. On the one hand, we're all going around every day, taking a shower in the morning, brushing our teeth, going to work or to school, hanging out with friends after work or after school. Our life gets meted out in days, and we live that life because what other choice do we have? And at the same time, we triangulate that life to this enormous sea change that is happening to our only home, and that is happening beneath our feet and above our head and in the air that we breathe. And it can feel very difficult, at least for me, to square the texture of my quotidian life with the enormity of the change that is taking place on our planet right now. And so I embarked on this book, on the process of writing this book, because I felt like a knot of thought and feeling kind of constricting itself in my chest that had to do with the cognitive dissonance imbued by that gap, by that dual consciousness. And I intuited that if I didn't take time to unspool that knot and to orchestrate for myself a genuine emotional encounter with the truth of the climate crisis, if I didn't somehow try to engage with the enormity, then something in me was just going to break. I wouldn't be able to keep doing the work. And I realized by the end of the writing process that the thing that I was trying to do through a kind of like sheer force of will / like writing myself around this orbit was to close that gap between knowledge and realization, to try to do the impossible thing of encountering the enormity of the climate crisis and not allowing it to be simply, I think two main methods through which we encounter it in like mainstream culture and media. One is just like blunt, dead facts that arrive at you in a news article, like there are 423 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, or we have, 6 years to cut 50% of humanity's carbon emissions, all these numbers that can feel hard to invest with meaning because they're so abstract. And on the other hand, as sort of the 24-hour disaster news cycle where you wake up in the day and scroll through Twitter and you see images of just devastating apocalyptic floods in Pakistan, and then you scroll past it. And then by the next day, the 24-hour news cycle has moved on and that thing fades from view. And both of those streams of information felt very much like knowledge to me and very distant from realization. And so I wanted to close that gap, and that's why I wrote this book. And there's an amazing quote that I encountered after writing the book by the famous Catholic, primarily anti-war, anti-nuclear activist Daniel Berrigan, himself describing another progressive Catholic activist named Dorothy Day, who is a very amazing woman. And he said of her, and I really love this quote, "She lived as if the truth were true." And I think that's actually an incredibly difficult proposition. Because as Joan Didion, another amazing woman and a phenomenal writer, famously said, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. So all of us, to a certain extent, are living the story, right? The self is a kind of story, which is to say a kind of fiction. And I guess when I say that, what I mean is that the essential fiction of personal subjectivity is that you spend, or at least I spend, perhaps there are some truly remarkable altruists in the room, but the way I encounter existence is through the lens of a very arbitrary individual among 7.5 billion individuals on planet Earth named Daniel Sherrell. There's no real reason that my focus on the life of the person named Daniel Sherrell is incredibly disproportionate to my person or any individual person's importance with regard to the sweep of history, the sweep of humanity, the totality of the universe. But we encounter reality through an arbitrary personalized lens called the self. And in some ways, the self is a useful fiction. It allows us to encounter the profusion of reality without getting overwhelmed. And we have this little kind of pawn that we move through life, and there's like a radius of attention that surrounds it, and it encounters different things. I share that just to say, and that was a kind of Buddhist concept reference in the passage I wrote, that all of us are sort of, we're sort of nested in Russian dolls of stories. The self is a story, society is a story. And those stories are useful, and they also excise truth in critical ways, because the truth is an enormous thing. It is all of reality, and it's very difficult to internalize. So, and I think in some ways, the incredible crisis that humanity finds itself in right now with regard to the climate has to do with living in a story that prevents us from living as if the truth were true, to quote Daniel Berrigan. And there are many ways to describe that story, but one way to describe it is that for a lot of the historical era that we call modernity, the narrative around technological progress was that humanity was becoming more and more powerful, more and more godlike, and that allowed us to sort of subjugate and control the natural world. We had, through sheer force of will and moxie and inventiveness, placed ourselves not only at the top of the pecking order biologically, but almost at the top of the pecking order geologically. We could shape whole rivers and bend them to our will. We could dam them. We could generate power from them. We could shoot rockets into outer space. We could level whole forests to build our homes. We could literally move mountains in some cases if there was coal underneath them to be mined. And this was a very powerful story for probably the 2.5 centuries following the Industrial Revolution, because it appeared to be true. You know, humanity was scoring victory after victory, it seemed. And it seemed as if nature was essentially laying down in our path a kind of mute, dead object that we could manipulate. And I think the essential crux of the climate crisis is that it proves that what we thought was a story of inevitable progress looks a lot more like a story, like the story of Icarus, of somebody flying too close to the sun, not realizing that their wings were held together with wax. We are re-encountering the ways in which the natural world and the planet we live on still sort of sits above us, to the extent that we are at the mercy of its patterns, of its climate patterns, and also, of course, although this wasn't always obvious, the solvency, the strength of our economy relies on the strength of the ecosystems in which it is based. This has been a very hard story to let go of for us as a species, and maybe more pointedly for like the late capitalist West as a society. You know, letting the world edit your story of self, whether you're a society or an individual, letting the world edit that story is really difficult. And I can say that as a writer, you know, allowing anybody else to edit your story, there's something very personal about it. And I think it gets harder as you get older, as the society ages and atrophies, as people get older. And really, ultimately, what the climate movement is about, and the climate movement, you know, I believe to be one of the most important social movements of our generation and of our century, and a thing that has been the biggest honor of my life to be a part of. The climate movement is really about preferring a new kind of story and trying to move, or rather kind of trying to strip away layers of stories that are no longer useful and help move the world from knowledge to realization, which means changing policies, of course, but it also means changing what's common sense, changing the set of ideas that's in broad circulation. And you see, you know, in the United States today, and of course I'm calling you from Australia, but who are we kidding? I still follow the American news cycle on a basically daily basis. As Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick says, that the process of moving from knowledge to realization is exactly that. It's a process. It takes a very long time. And you have to choose to embark upon it. And especially trying to realize something with the enormity and the ubiquity and the abstraction of the climate crisis is really, really difficult. To fit that into your heart without it breaking, that's really hard. And you can see American society arrayed along the spectrum between knowledge and realization. So on one end, you can see, you know, some Republican states, for example, some Republican attorney generals refusing even knowledge. Really, it's kind of like red states versus the world on climate change. They're passing laws that prevent people from investing in renewable energy and prevent the mention of climate change in school curricula, and give even further subsidies to the oil and gas industry, sort of as a culture war issue. It's insanity manifest, but what it really is clinging to an especially virulent form of the story of modernity that I've described, an unwillingness to let go of that story, because again, a lot of people have invested their personhood in that story, and so letting go of it is a scary thing. And then you have the Biden administration, which, you know, I have basically no issue saying it has been the most past the most ambitious climate policies in American history. Like, this presidency has been a breakthrough on climate policy. Not only the almost $400 billion Inflation Reduction Act, which is supercharging the renewable energy economy, but they've just introduced historic EPA regulations to transition cars from gas to electric, and historic regulations on power plants to limit carbon emissions from power plants over time. But also, all of this comes alongside doing things like approving massive new oil fields. For example, the oil field that President Biden recently approved, called the Willow Project up in Alaska, which it's a particularly dystopian project. It's a massive oil extraction project in a very fragile national wildlife refuge. But it's also all permafrost, which is melting because of climate change. And you can't build pipelines on melting permafrost. So I think it's Chevron that owns Willow. They've installed chillers, like artificial, basically air conditioners, underground air conditioners in the permafrost to chill it, to combat the effects of climate change that they are causing, in order to keep the permafrost sturdy enough to lay a pipeline over. It's like literally catch-22 dystopia stuff. It's really, really wild, like a snake eating its tail. And what you're seeing there in the Biden administration is competing stories, and different departments, different people, the same person on different days, toggling between the spectrum of knowledge and realization. And on the one hand, really promoting renewable energy, on the other hand, being as yet unwilling to phase down fossil fuels in the way that the science tells us is necessary. And then further down the spectrum, you see, I encounter climate activists who look at, for example, things that the Biden administration is doing with the building of the Willow Project in Alaska, and continue to tell a story of doom, essentially, that a fatalistic story about the fate of the planet, and essentially that we can't save ourselves, that it's too late. And I think all of these stories, in a certain sense, act as buffers against realization. There's the buffer that the Republicans are applying, a buffer against knowledge, but some of the climate activists are applying a kind of binary story, when the facts on the ground are much more complicated. And here I'll add a note of hope that is a different headspace than the headspace I wrote the book in. There were times right after writing the book where I would add a note of hope at the end of my lectures, and it would feel a little obligatory, like that those words would be coming out of my mouth, and I wasn't quite sure if I believed them. But I wrote the book in a very different place, climatologically and geopolitically, than the place we're in now. And it's really only been 5 years since I started writing that book. When I first put pen to paper, the best predictions from things like the Carbon Tracker Institute, I think it's called, predicted that we were headed for warming between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. This was true. That was true, literally, as recently as 5 years ago. And anywhere between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius of warming was truly, the best way to describe it would have been an apocalyptic level event, like civilization ending. Like you couldn't feed and water everybody on Earth. There would be mass human die-off. Like the predictions around what a world that was 3.5 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial times, the prediction of what that world looked like were deeply, deeply grim. And that was the trajectory we were on. And Trump was president, and it was a time where the daily project of finding a narrative of hope to keep you going and to keep walking forward was really difficult, and something I struggled with every day when I woke up to write. But in the past 5 years, we've actually witnessed a sea change, and I don't think everybody has completely tuned into it yet. But through a few factors, through massive technological advancement, the fact that the price of wind and solar has plummeted drastically, to the extent that they're now the cheapest forms of energy in the world, and because the global climate movement built real political power and started shifting the consensus in democracies around the world, we have moved the policy needle and we have moved the technological needle enough so that we're now headed, the best predictions are for about 2.5, between 2.5 and 2.8 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century, which is both a huge improvement on where we were headed and also still a very, very bad outcome, particularly for lots of poor people, most of them in the global south. And so that leaves us we're in a very interesting moment in history right now. Because on the one hand, you have countries really only in the past 2 years has to use a bad metaphor, the rubber's really hit the road. Like, large economies are pouring billions and billions of dollars into the renewable energy transition. So we had the US pass the Inflation Reduction Act, but we've also had massive investment packages passed in Europe, in Japan, even in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are investing $300 billion in the clean energy revolution because they see the writing on the wall. And at the same time, a lot of our governments are still experiencing a form of state capture by the fossil fuel industry. And what I mean by that is the fossil fuel industry is still perverting democratic outcomes away from scientific conclusions and in the direction of the needs of the shareholders of those companies. And where all that leads us is that right now, we are headed for a world that is both not saved, but also not without hope. And the best case scenarios, that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the gold standard set by the UN, because of the political delays caused by the fossil fuel industry in large part, that goal is getting further and further and out of reach. But the apocalyptic scenarios, the truly apocalyptic scenarios, are also getting less and less likely. And so we're in this interesting middle ground where things are going to get worse before they get better, but we still also have enormous ability to shape the trajectory of future warming and also to see how we respond as a society to the disruptions that we know are going to be caused by that warming. And that situation, I think, requires a few new truths to be engaged with, that I've been thinking about a lot in the last several months as we've witnessed this policy sea change take hold in democracies around the world. The first, and I think of this from the perspective of the climate movement and from young climate activists in general. When I came of age in the climate movement, we were completely in the political wilderness. We were building political power from nothing, essentially, a bunch of 20-year-olds who didn't know what the fuck we were doing. And renewable energy technology was relatively expensive still compared to fossil fuels. And we spent a lot of our time and a lot of our political capital blocking things, right? Locking ourselves to pipelines, trying to block legislation that would permit the construction of new oil wells, trying to tax an industry that was creating so much grievous social harm. It was a movement that could afford to just say no. And that has changed a lot. I think it is coming more and more into vision that in order to arrive at a place that we can call climate safe, we're going to have to build a whole lot of new things over the course of the next decade, let alone the next century. When I say build, I'm talking about wind turbines and solar panels, of course, but also electric vehicles and high-speed rail and transmission lines and home heat pumps and manufacturing facilities for green steel and green hydrogen. There's a whole new economy we have to build in a new industrial base, and we have about 30 years to do it. And so the climate movement right now is in an interesting moment of trying to bend towards that truth, of not just keep it in the ground, which was the old mantra, but also build it from the ground up. And on the other hand, I think you have the world of governments, the corporate world, that can no longer indulge, should never have indulged, but really can no longer indulge now, any magical thinking on what needs to be done on the world's climate budget, essentially, and how little of it is left. And this requires kind of transcending a deeply embedded and persistent story that bends, at this point, it bends away from truth. And it's really a central myth embedded in, I guess you could call it capitalism, in the modern economy and how the profit motive operates. But this, the myth that we're all just individuals, and that if you kind of keep your head down, sow your own plot, maximize your own profit, you don't really need to take in a wider advantage. The system will take care of itself if everybody's just focused on their little plot of reality. And the overweening truth that the climate crisis forces us to encounter is not a kind of personal independence, but in fact a terrible, like an awesome and awe-inducing level of interdependence. The fact that every person alive is impacted, is both emitting carbon to a greater or lesser degree, and Americans emit, 40 times the daily carbon dioxide of, let's say, the average subsistence farmer in India. But everybody, through engagement in the economy, emits carbon, and everybody is impacted by the effects of the climate crisis caused by that carbon. And so when you think about carbon dioxide, it can sound abstract, but it's sort of like this, it's like the material web of interdependence. And a little ripple in that web, a ton of carbon dioxide emitted by, a flight from San Francisco to New York in some very material but causally distant way impacts how rain falls in the Bengal in Bangladesh, which impacts the crop yields there. And just because that causal chain is quite long and complicated doesn't mean there's not a cause and an effect there. And so it is creating these, what the climate crisis does is basically create all these overlapping lines of cause and effect across vast distances of space and time. Distances of space and time we have a hard time internalizing, that feel very abstract to us. And as hard as it is, I think it is the ethical responsibility of living in the 21st century to not look away from the truth of that interdependence. And it can feel really hard. I think there are a lot of people I talk to who acknowledge that, who know in some way the truth, the fact of that independence, but struggle to realize it or resist realizing it, because it feels like a burden. I really have to live my own life and simultaneously think about the numerous and intricate beyond belief connections I have to every other life. That seems like a huge burden. But I think there's really another way of seeing it, which is to flip it on its head and see what the climate crisis is doing to us as forming a sort of great and unprecedented historical togetherness. And what I mean by that is that, we're a single species, a large species, a fragile species, a species that is both too smart and also somehow too dumb for the level of power we've attained. And we're orbiting on this little rock in a void, and we can't, as far as we know, survive anywhere else in that void. And there's a way in which, when, for example, a natural gas company or a coal company says, "Oh, we can go ahead and follow the desire of our stakeholders and open up this new drilling field. It's a denial of that essential togetherness, right? It's a choosing to look away from that truth. It's a resistance of realization. And I think that's wrong, obviously, but I also think it's a shame, because there's something massive and tragic and beautiful about the togetherness, the human togetherness that is being backlit by the climate crisis, that it took the climate crisis for us to be able to start to realize. Because we are involved right now in an unfolding geological story that implicates every single person on the planet. Like, it's really hard to take in, but climate change is a thing that will impact the daily life, increasingly impact the daily life of every single person living on planet Earth. And that will be, in some ways, the meta-narrative of our generation. And so, I think somebody's got to go on mute. Anyway, I think it really is incumbent on us to begin acting like the truth were true, which is to say, to begin acting like we're in this together. Because in the most profound sense, we are. And that's a thing that I was able to brush the garment of that realization in writing this book. And it's a thing that I feel like I also have to re-realize every day. But it's not a thing that's only imbued with tragedy. I think there's a deep beauty to it. And I try to lean into that beauty when I'm pursuing my climate activism. So I've been blabbering, I think, for about half an hour now, maybe more. So I'll stop there. Thanks again, Tom, for having me. And thank you all for reading a passage of the book.
Dan, I think everyone would say it wasn't lather at all. Really, really very interesting. I'm going to open it up to questions, but I'm going to take the very first one, if I may. And because I think it segues just nicely on how you finished. I was struck by your comment or by your quote by Berrigan about Dorothy Day living as if the truth is true. And in the passage that the class had all read and we discussed before you came on, we were also struck by the comparison you made to the soldier who was in Iraq, approached every morning as if he were already dead. And then the parallel that you said, even at the time where you weren't really sure that you were doing it, you're going through the motions. I think it was when you were working in Albany in New York. Maybe just to start out, something, because I think it would be of interest, and I know it was greatly interesting last year. Would you talk a little bit about even those times where when you weren't sure if what you were doing was going to serve any purpose, that you went ahead and did it anyway, and something good came from it? I'm thinking perhaps of Albany, perhaps of your work in before you went to Australia.
Yeah.
Just to kick off there, and then after that, we'll let people in the room and online ask the question. So thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. That's a good question. And it takes me a little bit to like remember myself back into those moments. But I think on the days when, and it wasn't every day, but it happened with some regularity where I had to approach the work and it felt like my well of hope had run dry, or the narrative of hope that I was weaving out in front of me, like I didn't know where it was going anymore. I couldn't see what the next step in the path was. I guess working in the climate movement took on a kind of devotional quality. And by that, I mean, I'm doing this work because of the people I love, and the people I love includes, my family and friends, but it also includes, in some ways, like I love people writ large. I'm really, whatever the opposite of a misanthrope is. I love humans, and in many ways love the society we've created together. And I also like our home that we share. And my climate activism is just the enactment of those loves that are pretty deeply held. And I guess I would just say to myself, fighting for things you love, even if it's futile, is like a meaningful act and a thing that I'm honored to be able to do with my life. And that could sometimes feel like a kind of meager gruel existentially, but it would get me through the hard days. And then suddenly hope would come, swoop me off my feet again out of nowhere. And hope is a remarkably sustainable resource if you cultivate it. And there were a lot of times where it was foiled in Albany and I had to fall back on other more philosophical postures. And there were sometimes, right before I moved to Australia, I was deeply involved in the final 6-month push to try to get the Inflation Reduction Act across the finish line, which was Biden's big climate bill. It was killed in the Senate 3 times over by Joe Manchin, who is also the literal owner of a coal company. And almost the entire activist world had taken it for dead. And then a small core of us kept pushing, hoping against hope. And then it was resurrected in the closest thing I've seen to a political miracle in, 10 years of working in politics. So that has given me, there's a little I was given a little carrot, or I was tossed a little bone in terms of the benefits of holding out hope. I've actually seen that. I feel like I've seen it in action in a big historical way there, and it's very satisfying. And that sort of win makes me even more able to apply hope in an uncertain scenario going forward. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
That's good when you ask your questions, just to give your name. So that knows who's
Of course. Good morning, Mr. Sherrell. My name is Emma Timms. And my question is, I really like the way that you spoke about your acts towards climate change, because it's very poetic. It's something different that I haven't heard. And so I would say, considering that fossil fuels and oil-based industrialism have thrived due to low manufacturing costs and low consumer pricing in comparison to its green counterparts, how do you think the future of green energy will become a more graspable and accessible concept to those who are currently not able to afford or do not have access to transfer to electric or renewable energy?
It's a really good question, and it's ultimately a question of climate and environmental justice. I think that the climate movement is increasingly vocal about campaigning for policies that will make sure that the benefits in terms of cost savings of the switch to renewables don't just flow to rich people first and trickle down, hopefully, to working class and middle class people in the decades to come, but actually that there are those families that are given preferential treatment in terms of tax incentives, etc. And there's some of that in the Inflation Reduction Act. Like if you make over a certain amount, I forget what it is, 150K a year, you are not given access to certain tax rebates for electrifying your home, for instance. But if you are, on the other hand, are a recipient of food stamps, you're given additional incentives to electrify your home to try to make it a thing that is accessible to everybody. So that policy landscape is starting to change, and I think technology change is also driving a lot of these improvements down the cost curve. But it's going to take an active decision, I think, on the part of governments and on the part of societies that the benefits of the switch and these new industries flow to working people and working communities, especially, and don't just do the traditional thing, which is go to the profit margins of the corporations that own the technology and thus to their shareholders, a much, much smaller and richer portion of society. And there's a struggle right now, frankly, as the renewable energy economy is being born. And frankly, we have added jet fuel to that process in the last few years. There's a struggle over that industry is going to generate a lot of prosperity. It's going to generate a lot of jobs. What will be the quality of those jobs? Will they be like good family sustaining jobs, or will they be exploitative? And where will the fruits of all that labor and all that new tech go? Will they be distributed equitably across American society, for instance, or will they sort of pile up in offshore bank accounts that are tax avoidant in like St. Croix? And I think that's you are naming a real point of tension right now in the policy and political landscape. And I think you're right to name it, because it's if the renewable energy transition doesn't lift people into the middle class and keep them there, then it's not going to work. It just won't have the social license. And so it's really, really important that we get those policy settings right.
Oh, wow. Look at that. Sorry. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I was actually wondering how writing this book changed how you went about your work afterwards, as you kind of started this journey from knowledge to realization.
Ah, such a good question. I think I'm still sort of learning that myself. On the simplest level, it allowed me to continue the work. It felt like writing this book was going back. I'd been building a house with no foundation in some ways, and I had several stories already, but they were pretty teetery. They were teetering, and I had to go back and actually think about the work I was doing, encounter the problem that I was ostensibly struggling against, and in so doing, build myself a foundation. So it's made the work more sustainable. But I also feel like it's allowed me to inhabit like a fuller sense of self when I'm doing political work. And that can be really hard, because politics does not always incentivize vulnerability, certainly, but even emotion, really. It can be a transactional space, and it can be a kind of bloodless space, like a game of chess. And I guess writing this book has made me, as I'm attempting to engage in that game of chess, also be more present with myself about what I'm feeling. And that in some ways makes the work feel more human, feel less daunting. And I think in a very practical way, I wrote this book, and then a lot of people I love read it, and suddenly it opened up a space for us to talk about things we hadn't been able to talk about. And cry about things we hadn't been able to cry about, and also just like scream and commiserate and laugh. And I'm talking about like, these are like my closest friends who read the book. And it sort of felt in retrospect like I tried to will a community and will a conversation into being by like writing this book as a provocation. And before writing the book, I felt a little bit like I was holding all the emotions expressed in the book inside. And that sort of holding inside felt like a kind of loneliness. And I think I feel less lonely after putting it out into the world.
Thank you so much. My question is kind of philosophical, because after reading the passage, I was thinking about my siblings, my younger siblings, and my niece, and like the headspace that they're coming into consciousness with. So like we talk about my generation as like the generation after 9/11, where we don't know a world without 9/11, and my siblings like don't really know a news cycle without, the death of our planet at the forefront of it. And my niece is 3, and so she's going to come into consciousness and like a reality where we're at like the point of no return, or we could be at the point of no return. So do you think that they are in like a different position with confronting their reality, or will like the reality of the problem just be like a buried thought, or are they going to be like better at coping with it than we are?
Another really good question. Yeah, my heart goes out to Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I think is what they're being called now. I feel like as a young millennial, I was able to have a childhood. I was able to have like a relatively extensive childhood, like 0 through 10, before having to really encounter A, the fact of the climate crisis, and B, the ubiquity of the internet. Like I lived in a pre-internet childhood where like to get on dial-up, you still had to like hear your like fax machine screech for like 30 seconds before you could like go to askjeeves.com or whatever, and the whole thing felt slower and just like less intrusive into one's life. And I'm like, I have to say grateful every day that I had that. And also I can't, coming into political consciousness in the world that it is right now strikes me as inordinately difficult. And I think my interactions with people in high school right now is that they're sort of being forged in fire, to put it bluntly, and they're incredibly fierce and politicized in a way that I was not in high school. And I admire them a lot. But it's also clear if you look at the data, you know, there's a study that came out a year ago, survey of about 100,000 people between the ages of 16 and 26 in 50 countries. And the levels of things like climate anxiety and just, you know, depression and fear of the future were really, really high, like way over 50% in a lot of cases. And I think that, and so I think that implies like, you know, not being a member of those generations, like I don't think they will have a very different relationship with the problem. I think they already do, and that is clear, and that's borne out of in study after study. And so how can we make sure as a society that the way that young people encounter the climate crisis isn't just doom scrolling by themselves on Twitter or TikTok, like very late at night, with no community to help them hold the weight of the reality, but that there are cultural avenues for emotional processing, and also cultural avenues and political avenues for taking action. And the youth climate movement in this country has gone from 0 to 60 truly in terms of its political power. Like the Biden administration is scared of the youth climate movement and what it can do to its electoral prospects if they piss it off, which is a total change from the Obama administration. And I think being able to access and wield that kind of power is really important for combating a sense of despair. Because I think despair is engendered by powerlessness. Those two things go together very well. And in fact, young people are not powerless. We're probably more politically powerful as a bloc than we've been in the last 50 years in this country. And we got to lean into that, because increasingly we live in a gerontocracy, by which I mean like the most powerful people in the country are all over 70 and in some cases over 80. And the boomers are really like, you know, they are clinging on to positions of power the world over, probably long past the point where that necessarily made strategic sense. And so, you know, we have to steel ourselves as a generation and be ready to lead, because our leadership is long overdue. And I don't know, that's going to require, again, a sense of togetherness and not of isolation. And I think it's also useful, you know, I think the most hopeful people I know are the people who are really dug into this issue, involved in the climate movement following the news cycle, because I think there is actually, even more so than like 5 years ago, there's a real reason for hope, and there's progress happening. And the global policy landscape is shifting, not fast enough, but it is shifting. And I think the people who are least hopeful are the ones I know who don't really encounter the climate crisis that often, but when they do, it's in the form of like a truly apocalyptic headline from a wildfire or a flood somewhere, and then they turn away. And if that's your only touch point with the crisis, then you're going to feel like we're doomed, which won't be true, but will feel true. And so I think we have to push against that shallow engagement with the problem in favor of a deep engagement, which I think paradoxically will lead to more hope. That was a very long-winded answer, but that's because I think it was a very good, rich question.
I thought it was a rich answer too. Maybe just following up one thing with it, as the sole boomer in the room, who also comes from the reddest state in the United States, and actually I'm a resident of Carbon County, Wyoming.
Wow.
I was again, I was struck last year when you spoke about some of the work that you've done, where you managed to get people that started from very different viewpoints on climate and very different political perspectives, that you managed to bring them together where common ground was found. I'm thinking in particular of what you did in Albany. I would say that Simmons is very much of the same kind of view on climate as you experienced in Providence and Brooklyn and beyond. But any tips on political activism, on reaching out to people who may, at this point, not be starting from the same place to find that common ground?
Yeah. I think about this a lot, and I think about the increasing kind of tribalism in American life, where there's red America and blue America, and never the two shall mix. I think that's a very bad state of affairs, and like, you know, obviously I vociferously disagree with Trump and with the MAGA movement, but I definitely do not believe that every person that votes for Donald Trump is an evil person. Far from it. I think different social worlds construct very different senses of reality, and we still have to find ways to bridge those social worlds. So I guess the biggest tip I have, and the things that have been most successful in building political coalitions across big differences, is just humanizing people, you know, not approaching them as like a symbol for a set of beliefs or a big scary other from, you know, who's your opponents, but just recognizing that, like, you know, the Twitter algorithm and the news cycle like drives these algorithmic wedges between us and portrays the other side as monsters, and you know, that goes in both directions. And it's really not true. Once you meet most people you meet on the ground, they're just pretty regular, you know, and they are interested in similar things, which is like, I don't know, having work that feels meaningful and gives them some dignity, but also not working too hard, and be able to go on vacation with their family once in a while, and trying to find some meaning above their existence, whether that means going to church or playing in a rock band or reading poetry. And I don't know, if you just take the masks off for a second, the interpersonal divide between people who don't share political beliefs is always, in my experience, way narrower than you would assume if you were watching CNN or Fox News all day. And so that's just important to remember, is just to meet people and to remind yourselves that they're not monsters, that they're mostly just people. But I also think that there's an increasing tendency, I think, certainly on the right, but also on the left to a certain extent, of xenophobia, of really not wanting to have to interact with people that have different views with you, and views that you think are in some cases abhorrent. And I think there just needs to be acknowledgement that you can't build winning political coalitions if you only talk to people that already believe everything that you believe. Like, you'll feel very comfortable and you'll feel like very, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, I guess, vindicated consistently. But you won't be able to win lasting change because you just can't form a big enough swath of society to win lasting change if you're only talking to the people in your little clubhouse. So just reminding ourselves strategically that whether you like talking across difference or not, the only way you're going to change the world is by doing it. And I think that rise of social media has kind of paradoxically allowed us not to have to do that. And I think it's a skill we should, it's a skill that we should cultivate. Because it's deeply, deeply necessary.
And if we can keep you awake for 4 more minutes.
Yep.
Okay, for one more question. Great.
Yep.
Riham? And then we'll make this a final question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Riham. I think first and foremost, I disagree slightly with your response in the last question. And I think that it comes down to, I just think that was a very privileged response, because working with folks who threaten and don't believe in your existence doesn't feel right. And so I felt like it was important to address that. But in terms of my question, because we only have 4 minutes, my question is, given that climate change and environmental insecurity significantly affects the global South and generally BIPOC folks globally, how has the climate movement or climate activism failed to address those who are disproportionately targeted? And in contrast, how has the movement properly addressed addressed centering BIPOC and just overall those who are disproportionately affected by climate change?
It's a really good question. So I think obviously the environmental movement in this country for a long time failed wildly to see the climate crisis for what it is, which is a class issue and like a perpetuation of a kind of colonial racism, where enormously wealthy fossil fuel companies, mostly in the global South, could just, in the global North, could plunder the global South for profit and ignore the consequences. And for a long time, I think the environmental movement took that dynamic and mostly made it into a thing about, you know, changing your light bulbs and protecting the polar bears. And that was a very easily digestible narrative in suburban white America, but it just wasn't true. It wasn't getting at the crux of the issue. I think the climate movement has done a lot of growing over the past decade to try first to come to terms with the fact that the environmental movement wasn't born with Earth Day in the 70s. Like, in some ways, indigenous people around the world have been engaged in a form of holistic environmental activism for millennia and millennia that was marginalized for a long time, and the wisdom of which is now coming into full view. So part of it is just listening to the answers that were there all along in indigenous worldviews that, for example, treat every decision as something that you need to approach with 7 generations in mind. This is the Native American indigenous belief that there's a responsibility to 7 generations worth of people, and not just within your own lifetime. But I think it's a learning process. It's, again, a transition from knowledge to realization, and it's not complete. And I think there's still a lot of people in the climate movement, or there's a section of the climate movement that like sees people like Elon Musk or, I don't know, venture capitalists that are funding new battery technologies as as the leaders we need to see us through this crisis. And I think if we trust the profit motive to lead us away from this crisis, then we'll really be screwed. But if we take our cues from the people who are worst affected by the climate crisis and have done the least to contribute to it, it'll be a much better North Star. But it's a long, long process. And I think I really appreciate your comment. And it's something I feel like I'm still thinking through. And obviously, you know, for example, the Trump movement in this country is waging an all-out assault on the rights of trans people across the country. And that is like a sickening and horrifying thing to witness. And I wouldn't expect my trans friends, just because they're trans, to be on the front lines of that battle, in which they're the most vulnerable. I think there are ways to wield privilege in progressive spaces, where if you're comparatively safe, it is your responsibility to engage and to persuade and to win. And I think bowing out from those sort of struggles is a choice that is accessible and valid for everyone, but also a choice that, if I take it as a cis person, then I'm refusing to wield whatever small amount of power I have to try to move the political dial. And I guess at the end of the day, I believe in human salvation. Like, I would much rather, for the people who think that they hate trans people, even though they've never met a trans person, I would much rather those people access the common humanity that I believe exists within them, rather than go screw themselves and burn in hell. Like, I want the former outcome and not the latter. I'm not naive to think that it'll happen in every instance, but that is the horizon of my politics, is liberatory and emancipatory, rather than punitive on either side. But it's a very difficult tightrope to walk, and I think you're right in naming it.
Great. Dan, thank you very much. Go to bed. I'm going to go to their next 11 o'clock class here. So really very much appreciate it. Very interesting. And I think you're going to sell some more copies of Warmth over the summer after finals are done in a couple of weeks here. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks, everybody.